Good morning.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
So I'm going to ask everyone to mute their microphones if you don't mind. If you're not one of the speakers, please mute your microphones and we will invite you to participate as we get going. And in the meantime, I'd like to welcome Marilyn to do an introduction for us. And then we can explain how the program is going to go and we will get started. Oops. Nolan, I did not mean to mute you, sorry.
It's okay. Ready to go?
Yes, Marilyn, please.
Okay. I just want to thank you all for participating, and I want to particularly thank our hosts today for allowing us to be part of this project. It is, as all of you who are here at Fox Run, I hope know, this is a brand new effort on the part of Fox Run and of Erickson to address the issues that that complicate acceptance of people who are different from us, who don't think the way we think, who don't look the way we look, don't move the way we move. And so the Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Social Responsibility Committee, hereafter known as Diversity and Inclusion, wants to welcome you and hope that you will find I know that you will find a lot of interesting things in the stories that Mr. Henderson and Mr. Finley have to say to us. And you should have received an email from me indicating we have an on-site discussion group on Zoom following this at 12:30. If you didn't, send me an email. I'm in the directory and I'll send you the link.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. I really appreciate it. I'm Lynn Galadner and I work with Stephen Henderson and Nolan Finley on the Civility project. They're going to be the two celebrities that you want to hear from today, and I just sort of facilitate. And so one of the things that I'll be doing is monitoring the chat. So if you have questions as they're talking that you'd like them to answer, feel free to put a question in the chat, or there is the function to raise your hand, which you can do. And we'd love to hear from you guys as we go through the program. What I'd love to do to start is to just share a quick little video from our sponsor, Delta Dental, that makes this possible to come to all of you free of charge. And it's just a wonderful sponsorship. So let's hear from them first, and then we will jump into the program.
We are living in challenging times. Politics is polarizing. Racism is rampant. The pandemic is frightening, and families are divided. Tough times require more dialogue and more understanding. But navigating our differences constructively is hard work. Delta Dental believes that healthy, smart, vibrant communities are also civil and harmonious. They are places where disagreement does not have to be toxic or destructive. Civility starts with listening. Welcome to the Civility Project.
So welcome. We will start with an introduction about what the Civility Project is and how it came to be. What we're going to talk about today is why we might want to build civility, how we can go about doing it, and how we do it in really tough times. So I'd like to invite Nolan Finley and Stephen Henderson to start by explaining what the Civility Project is and how it came to be, and then we'll jump into other questions. So Stephen and Nolan, take it away.
Well, let's introduce ourselves first, Lynn. I'm Nolan Finley of the Detroit News, been there at the Detroit News in May, 45 years. I'm the editorial page editor and columnist at the News. And my dear friend, Steve Henderson, is the former editorial page editor at the Detroit Free Press. Now he plays multiple roles, including a radio show host on WDET every morning and executive editor of Bridge Magazine Detroit.
Yes, that's right.
Any number of other jobs.
I have 4 jobs.
The hardest working man in the media. And so, you know, we've been friends a long time. First got to know each other because of our jobs and first got put together because of our jobs. a lot of folks found it interesting to bring us together and hear his perspective from the left and my perspective for the right. And over the course of doing that for a while, we became good friends, and that sort of surprised a lot of people, bothered some people. But, we all remember a time in this country where it wasn't uncommon for people to be able to agree to disagree without avoiding each other and without coming to hate each other. And that's been less common in recent years. In fact, it's all but disappeared in recent years. And there's a growing movement of hate in this country. And this idea that we hate people because they don't agree with us, because they're not like this. And, that's what the Civility Project is trying to counter and try to show different options to creating such animosity between people who have political differences, because we've seen where it's taken us to this country. I mean, it's not where we're headed, it's where we are. And we are in a very difficult place. And the only way to get out is to talk our way out through civil conversations.
Yeah, I mean, as Nolan said, he and I have been at this for about 12 or 13 years now, both in terms of debating and arguing about politics and issues, but also we've been friends over that period of time. And as you said, there was some initial, I think, curiosity and puzzlement about how those two things could coexist. But over time, it grew to be even more unusual. And the reason that that's true is because of the things that have happened in our country over that time. 10 or 12 years ago, the level of dialogue across the political divide was really different than it is now. It wasn't great then, but it's so much more bitter now. It is so much more filled with animosity and the idea that you've got to destroy the people who disagree with you. And the Civility Project, I think, sort of owes a lot of its existence to the realization by Nolan and I that things were getting worse, and that the ability to do what we do, which is to have really engaged and spirited disagreements and arguments with one another, but not let them get to the idea of being destructive, was of increasing value to other people. And so we started to think about, well, what are the things that make this relationship work that way? What are the things that that define the civility that allows us to be able to maintain a friendship even though we disagree, and allows us really to have those really spirited arguments. Nolan and I don't shy away from the subjects that we disagree on. We're encouraged to talk about them, and a lot of times when we're talking about them, we get really worked up about it. People get upset. We get after each other, but there's a limit to that's important, and that's framed by a mutual respect and a mutual understanding of one another that I think is missing from an awful lot of other places in our country today. And so we decided that if we could share what it is we do and how it works with lots of other people, we could encourage more people to be civil, to be able to have disagreements and maintain relationships with the people you disagree with.
So you guys, where do we begin with even this concept of civility? How do we understand it? And then how do we start to try to build it in relationships and communities and workplaces? Where do we begin with this?
I think the first step is you've got to decide there's value in having relationships across the political divide, that you have to see the benefit in it for both you and for the greater good, that you're able to civilly converse. Maybe it's people you broke with because of politics or other disagreements, but you have to want to do it. I mean, you have to find the value in it for you. And once you get there, once you've decided this is something I want to do, this is something that will enrich me, I think you have to really commit to learning as much as you can about the person you want to engage with and you want to converse with. And I think that's what helped Steve and I so much, is that, the first thing we did, the first, how this evolved, is we got to know each other as people beyond our politics. And we came to understand the things that shaped our politics. And I think that's an important first step. It's what we recommend is, don't come in fighting. Don't come in with the gloves up. Come in with the idea that you want to understand the other person. What are the beliefs, the values, the experiences in their lives that shape their opinions? Because everybody comes to their opinions the same way, or most good people do. You take the information available, you take the facts, you take everything you know, and you apply your own personal values, your own personal experiences to it, and you come up with an opinion. If you come up with an opinion that's different than your neighbor's, doesn't make your neighbor stupid, it doesn't make you evil. It just means you're two people with different values and different experiences who came to different opinions. And if you can understand what those values and experiences are, it takes some of the suspicion out of it, and you gain some level of respect and understanding. And I think those are the essential ingredients to beginning a civil conversation.
Yeah. There was a kind of key moment for Nolan and I in doing that. A few years ago, the NPR program called StoryCorps came to Detroit. And StoryCorps is an effort to kind of capture recordings of people, Americans, talking about important relationships that they have with other Americans, and to talk about why those relationships work or why those relationships don't work, and how those relationships have sort of evolved or changed over time. And so when they came to Detroit, I thought it would be really interesting for Nolan and I to go down and record for an hour talking about our relationship. But I wanted us to do something really specific. I said, at that point, we've been having arguments about policy and politics and issues for about 10 years. We'd also become pretty good friends. But what I wanted us to do was to talk about where our ideas come from. What are the things that go into making me into a liberal or a progressive? What were the experiences that led me to believe that that was the way that I see the world? And the same thing for Nolan. What were the things that made him into a conservative? And so that's what we did for a full hour in this little Winnebago that StoryCorps carts around the country. You go in there and sit across a little table and talk for an hour. And it was really illuminating, I think, for both of us. It taught us some things that we didn't know about each other, even though we'd known each other for about a decade. I think we learned things that we didn't know. But I think it also gave us a really deeper understanding of where the other person's coming from and why they're coming from that perspective. And so after we were done with that, and as the dialogue in the country continued to just kind of deteriorate, I think we really saw that if we could convince other people to go through that exercise, to really sit down and talk with someone who you disagree with, but maybe don't know as much about as you should, and talk about the things that have led you to the place that you are, have led you to the beliefs that you hold, it can become sort of the doorway you walk through to be able to have civil disagreements with that person. And so that was a sort of pivotal moment in the development of this idea that we're now sharing with you.
And if you listen to that StoryCorps session, I think Lynn posted the link and it's on our website as well. I mean, you'll hear two people who are just polar opposites, not butting heads, not scrapping, not challenging each other, but really going deep to figure out who the other person was and enjoying the process and learning from it. And it was one of the most enjoyable experiences I've had. And I think if you listen to that, you'll come away better understanding what this project's all about.
So I did put that link in the chat if people want to take a look at it. And our website is greatlakescivilityproject.com. But Marilyn asked if you think COVID has made this even worse. And so maybe we can get into answering that question, but also there have been so many factors in the past year that have come up, politics and, racial turmoil, and of course the pandemic and so many things. And so maybe help us understand how these different factors have impacted our ability to be civil, and also, how we handle when it gets that extreme and stressful.
Well, 2020 might have been the most uncivil year in this country since since the Civil War. And did COVID exacerbate? Absolutely, because these are conversations, civil conversations, best happen in face-to-face settings. Trying to do these kind of conversations electronically increases the possibility and the likelihood of miscommunications and misunderstandings. And the isolation, I think, has raised fear, paranoia levels across our societies, raised anxiety, depression. We've all lived through it. And it has not been good for our mental health. And so people tend to lash out more when they're feeling those sort of emotions.
The other factor, I think, in COVID that has made things much harder is the different ways that it affects us. I mean, if you think about the spectrum of consequences from the pandemic, on one end, death and real sickness. I mean, those of us who live in cities like Detroit, experienced far more of that, I think, than people in other places did for reasons that have to do with the unfairnesses and inequalities that shape American life. I know 13 people who lost their lives to COVID last year. And every other person I know in Detroit knows at least that number, if not more. The other spectrum, of course, is the financial spectrum of consequence from COVID. People who lost jobs, people whose businesses had to close, and when you're dealing with, that kind of divide on top of the political divides that already existed, that people just can't see each other in across that divide. They can't understand what the other person is talking about and what the other person is feeling. And I'm not in any way trying to equate life and death with money, but for people who were on either side of that, I just acknowledge that it was really difficult to see the other side. And I could go on a long diatribe about the lessons from that, about dealing with the inequalities that exist outside the context of COVID, so that something like COVID doesn't exacerbate them. But that even though we haven't done that, it doesn't excuse us from trying to figure out ways to be able to talk to one another about these things, to make it clear to the other side what you might be feeling, but also not be disrespectful of what that other person might be dealing with. And it made things far more difficult last year than they normally are. And we're not past it, because COVID is still with us. The rollout of the vaccine is echoing some of the things that we saw last year. We still have real economic distress taking place in Michigan and all over the country. So the lesson is that we've got to be able to talk about these things, and the preparation for that needs to be before something like a pandemic hits, right? It's really hard to work those things out while everybody is stretched to unimaginable ends by public health, by economics, and all these other things.
So Mary asked a question. She wants to know, what steps would you advise to begin the engagement with someone you know you probably disagree with? So how do we go about that?
Well, we covered the first step. I mean, you have to have that get to know you conversation, and a real genuine, honest get to know you conversation. And then I think it's important to start to set honest goals for the conversations. What do you hope to get out of this? If you're hoping to learn, if you're hoping to gain a greater understanding of the other person, if you're hoping for a stimulating exchange of ideas, those are all good goals. If your goal going in is to convert, to win the argument, to change a mind through force of your superior ideas, if you will, it's not going to work. So you have to set honest goals, and why do you want to do this, and what's it worth to you, and then you have to commit to honest listening.
Yeah, honest listening is one of the things that we talk about as a core principle of civility, and we talk about it in different terms, I think, than we talk about the concept of listening in our lives otherwise. I think it's really easy for us to say that we're listening when we're not talking and allowing somebody else to talk. But often, I am guilty of this as much as anybody else is, often when we're not talking and someone else is, we're still in our own heads about our own thoughts, about the things that we're thinking about what they're saying, or the things that we want to say when they finally stop talking, or the judgment that we want to pass on the ideas that they're expressing. Which really is not listening. It is not talking, but it doesn't quite qualify as the kind of listening that we're talking about. We talk about listening as a much more active exercise, where you are not just thinking about your own thoughts while somebody else is talking. You're really thinking about theirs. You're really investing in what they're saying, and trying to figure out why they believe what they're saying, being curious about how they came to the conclusions that they're sharing with you. I use for myself a pretty simple test of whether I'm listening. One is, once the other person is done talking, could I repeat back to them pretty much the argument that they said? I mean, maybe not word for word, but certainly capture the spirit of the ideas that they were expressing. Could I say what they were saying, in the context and structure that they said it? The other test I have for myself is whether I have questions for that person after they're done talking, whether I have questions about how they came to the conclusions that they came to, or whether there's a point they made that that I'd like to know more about, so I really understand it. I think when I catch myself not doing either of those things, not really being able to say what somebody else said, or not being curious about what they said in a meaningful way, I know that I'm not listening. I'm not really listening to what they're saying. And when we talk about civility, that listening, that active listening, is kind of a bedrock of what we're talking about.
And the other thing I would add to that is, check your self-righteousness, check your smugness. If you're going into a conversation, thinking you're the only one who talks to God, and, you're out here to, show off your righteousness, it's not going to work. Go in thinking that other person, or knowing that other person also is convinced they're right. And so don't go in butting heads. Go in trying to learn, trying to mine from this conversation valuable things that you can think about, and helps you better understand the person you're dealing with.
So Doreen asked a really interesting question, which I think can be applied to so many situations, so many communities. But she said, what thoughts and recommendations might you have for our Fox Run community? We are 1,300 residents living together and sharing common experiences. We are neighbors, whether we want it or not. How do we build on that? That's such a good point, Doreen, too, because so many of us are in, whether it's a church community or a neighborhood or a workplace, with people that we might not choose, but what advice do you guys have for making that work?
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I'm not sure. I mean, and I think it's okay to say that. I'm not sure how you make that work. There are some places that this doesn't work, by the way. And I think it's okay to admit that. There are some situations where it's a little too difficult. You're dealing with somebody who's not really interested in a civil dialogue, who wants to score points or just reinforce what they think. We all know people like that. We all have people like that in our lives. I have people in my family who are like that, who have been trying for decades to get them to participate in a more civil exchange. But again, I think the idea is that you have to have that context of the relationship. You have to have something more than just the exchange over the disagreement to start with. Otherwise, it makes it impossible.
I would advise, be aware of the situation and the times we're in. This has been extraordinarily stressful for everyone. I imagine more so for you all. I'm not going to make a whole lot of assumptions, but I assume there's been some restrictions on your movements, on who can come in and who can come out. It's been stressful for lots of groups of people in these sort of communal situations. Cut each other a break. I mean, this is the time to cut some slack to people. People are going to explode, and they're going to, in the frustration and anxiety, lash out. Give people a break, be kind, if you will. We're all going through this, and everybody's facing different challenges you may not even realize in their own lives, in their families. This is the time for a little more kindness, a little more understanding.
Well, and also we talk about giving yourself a break. We are all under the same pressures because of COVID, because of the economic disruption, because of all the stuff that's going on. And some of the things that are going on are confusing, and they are challenging to the way that we would normally think them through or react to them. It's okay to say, I don't want to do this right now. I don't want to have this conversation right now because I don't feel ready to do it in a civil way. So I'm going to opt out. I think that's part of civility too, is knowing when you're not ready to have an exchange with somebody that is going to be productive and saying, well, we'll do it another time. I think there's got to be more room for that right now than there normally is, because of the stress that we are all really experiencing, and how long this has gone on. I mean, we're coming up on a year of COVID disruption. That's a long time. It's a long time not to have our lives under our own control. It's a long time not to be able to do the things that we normally do to stay sane. Give yourself a chance to think things through and get to a better space before you fight about politics.
And it's clear now we're not going to switch a light switch and everything's going to be the way it was before. I mean, we've changed habits and we've changed the way we interact with each other. We're more fearful, we're more suspicious. It's going to take a long time before people are as comfortable together as they were a year ago. I may never shake another hand, and I don't say that facetiously. I think, you think about how diseases like this spread, and in the beginning, before we knew as much, and you're going to events and shaking hands and what have you. I may never do that again. I may never feel comfortable doing that again. And so there's things like that that are rituals that bind us and bring us together that we've broken over this past year. And, they're not habits anymore. And it may change us coming out of this in a lot of different ways we haven't even thought about.
Well, like birthday candles too. I don't think I'm ever blowing out birthday candles again or eating
No.
someone's cake. But I wanted just to mention, Marilyn said that Fox Run was actually quarantined for 12 weeks before COVID because of a rampant GI infection. So you guys have had even more than we've had to deal with. So
How have you not killed one another is what I want.
So, well, Laura asked, how do you deal with your own anger and disappointment? And I'm assuming, Laura, that you're meaning before you enter into these conversations. And I thought that would be nice to answer, along with mentioning, you guys always talk about setting goals for the conversation and not, and always committing to come back. And so, like, it's not a one-time, one and done type of thing, but civility is something that might happen over time and taking breaks. So maybe share those insights along with answering Laura's question.
That's a good question, I think, and we're dealing with it a lot. I'm dealing with a lot from people who, had a lot of their emotion and a lot of their passion invested in the election. It didn't come out the way they wanted, and they're having a hard time getting past that and figuring it out. And I think the 4 words, "this too shall pass," are still relevant today. Things will change, and you can't withdraw. You can't back out. You can't get bitter. You can't reject and resist and all of those other things. You've got to get back in and work together for a better world. I mean, you can't withdraw. And I see too many people withdrawing, bunkering up, getting bitter, and it's not healthy. There'll be a time again when you're on top, and remember how you felt then.
Yeah. I mean, I also think that there's in modern politics, there is so much that we have decided is at stake with every decision and every change of election that actually doesn't ring as true as all of us think it will. I mean, yes, there are profound differences in the ways that one side might govern and the other side. And we've seen in the last 4 years how dramatically, an administration can mete out consequences for people it decides are its enemies. I mean, if you think of the things that immigrants have gone through in the last 4 years with the changes to their lives, the disruption to their lives, that kind of comes to mind. But part of part of what sustains the country and has sustained the republic for a really long time is the fact that those swings are unusual. Those radical swings back and forth are pretty unusual, and we've got to remember again that they are, and that they should be probably. When we think about politics, I mean, I hear from so many people who say Joe Biden will ruin their lives and things like that. And I think to myself, well, what does that really mean? I mean, what is the real change that you're anticipating that would make that true? We've got to decharge some of this in order to be able to talk about differences and differences of approach in a way that doesn't make it, life or death for everybody. There's no question that there are some things that get decided that do reach that level, but all of it doesn't. And for most of us, in fact, there is less at stake than we have been led to believe by, I think, social media, which kind of ends up being an echo chamber where everyone gets whipped up around the same things. And the 24-hour news cycle, which, every story on CNN or Fox News or MSNBC is now labeled as breaking news. Every single story, you turn it on 24 hours a day, and the banner across the top says breaking news, as though whatever's happening is the most urgent thing in the world. It's not true. That we have been led to that conclusion, I think, quite falsely.
But Steve, I do think we have to, as citizens, we all have to be mindful of the consequences and the danger of blowing up the rules and blowing up the institutions, things that have been going on the last 10, 20 years, when each party gets in power, trying to reshape the rules to give themselves that temporary advantage and make it easier to pass their agenda. I mean, the Constitution was designed to make change, a very deliberate process and a difficult process for a reason. I mean, it was designed to protect against majoritarianism. And I think there's danger. I agree with what you said, that things, really don't often change as dramatically as we fear, but we increase the possibility of that happening as we blow up the barriers that guarded against that. And we've seen it on both sides of the aisle. We saw it with court appointments. We are now seeing it with the talk of getting rid of the filibuster. These were all protections put in place to, make sure majorities can't come in and make sweeping change across the country. So I think as citizens, we got to watch for that.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. One of the things that makes that difficult, though, is the history of institutions like the filibuster, which you can't talk about it without tying it to Jim Crow and the efforts to disenfranchise millions of Americans and continue that disenfranchisement. It's hard to defend an institution when that's what its roots are. And I'm not going to sit here and defend it, but I acknowledge that despite those roots, there have been really important times that it has stopped over majoritarian will, and it has stopped things from swinging wildly back and forth, which is one of the things that leads to weakened democracies, right? Where you get these kind of demagogish extremes that take over and do what they want. But it's not possible to talk about those things without putting it in that full context, and that makes it harder, right?
And that's true, but you have to look ahead too, and what the consequences will be in the future. I mean, there's been an imperfect past for sure, but if you blow these up, what's the consequences for the future? What we have better to put in place to protect us from situations where one party has full control and is going to bowl full steam ahead. I think particularly in the Senate, those measures, those rules that we've lost over the last 10, 15 years, we're going to regret that. I think we're already regretting it. Certainly we did, a lot of people regretted it the last 4 years, and I think
Yeah.
will come more, others will regret the next 4. This idea of these huge, everybody grabbing power for today without thinking about the future is, a very negative aspect of
It's very
modern
dangerous. Yeah.
politics.
Yeah.
So Connie asked a question. She said, what about the times when history tells us we should have stood up, like witch hunts, Inquisition, slavery, civil rights, Nazi terror, to be civil and allow, and how does civility factor into that? How does it allow bad to spread? So how do we know when we should seek civility, and how do we know when we should take a different route?
Well, I mean, civility doesn't mean docility. There are things you have to stand up for, and you have to shout about, and you have to fight about. We've seen that many times in this country, and that's not, what we're talking about. We're not saying we need to be so civil that we can't stand up to injustice and we can't speak out loudly against it. What we're mostly talking about is that place in our personal lives where we've allowed hate to separate us. And I think when we're in these kind of times, when there are things you need to shout about, there's a lot of room for civil conversation too, to work together toward pragmatic solutions.
Yeah. I mean, the other way that civility relates to those kind of extremes is, is that it helps keep those extremes in the margins, which is where they're supposed to be, right? Most people are not supportive of Nazism or overt racism or disenfranchisement of women. But what we allow to happen is that those of us who disagree about certain aspects of that, we allow through incivility us to be sort of drawn into different sides, into sides that can't come together and even talk about how to get to these things that we ultimately all agree on, but we disagree about various aspects of or path to get to them. One of the important aspects, I think, of civility is each side's accountability to the other to call out the most extreme elements of its own ideology. We're seeing that play out really dramatically right now inside the Republican Party, for instance. That you've got a wing of the party that has a lot of power, has a lot of influence, that is destructive and does threaten our democracy. Civility between mainstream, ordinary Republicans and Democrats is the antidote to the power that these extreme elements have. And I think you would see more Republicans feel comfortable standing up and calling all of that out in a more dramatic way if you had a tighter bond between Republicans and Democrats over issues that don't quite reach that level. The lack of civility, I think, between the parties has eased the level of extremism that we're seeing right now, and seeing it, I think more actively on the right than anywhere else. But it isn't always that way. I mean, it just happens to be what we're seeing at this moment.
So it's interesting because Jeanette and Barbara and Sherwin asked some questions that I think go together, and so we'll put them out there. So Jeanette said, do these conversations only work if both parties are truly interested in listening to the other person's views? And then Barbara and Sherwin said, what is the relationship among facts, emotions, and civility? And I sort of want to piggyback that. I've been wanting to ask you guys to talk a little bit about how we can have a good starting point when definitions of fact are sort of come under scrutiny. And, it's no longer, I remember the days when you knew which news organizations you could trust and were reliable and which ones were exaggerated or embellished. I don't know that most people know that anymore. So how do we respond to that? How do we start from a good starting point?
Well, and as we've seen, what's fact today, tomorrow, we learn differently. And I think that's one of the aspect of sort of the reckless journalism that has come out of this cable news world and internet world, where there is no hierarchy of credibility, and where the news outlets themselves are pandering to extreme elements and affirming opinions rather than simply presenting facts. So it's a difficult world. I mean, the explosion of news sources and 24 hours news, has in some ways made us a more informed society, but in other ways made it easier for us to be misinformed. And I think as good citizens, we have to really pay some attention to vetting our news sources and the places we're getting information from. It's easy to sit there and listen to somebody who is echoing your opinion under the guise of delivering news and feel perfectly comfortable. But it's also easy to get misinformed that way. You should be listening to some outlets that don't share your opinion. And I wish there were more places that would give you the news without opinion. And I think we have to be careful to be good citizens. We have to be careful consumers of news.
Yeah, I mean, I have become a big proponent of what I think is a space for common ground across the ideological spectrum, at least for this discussion, and that is to root more of our own inquiries about facts and news in the idea that facts need to be evidence-based, right? I mean, it's one thing for me to say, hey, I think that I think that this election was fraudulent. I think people cheated to make Joe Biden the president. But the first question needs to be, well, how can you prove that? What's the evidence you're using to say that that's true? And here's the evidence that says it's not. I think that's something that both sides can agree is a rational approach to vetting information. It's certainly the process that respectable news organizations go through before they publish things. Newspapers in particular have long established practices to talk about what's true and what's not. How do you know that? Is a question that gets asked all the time. I think that's a good starting point for the pushback against the relativism that has been assigned to the difference between truth and fact. I mean, there has been this effort to say, well, that's your view of it. My view is this, and they both are okay, which is a threat itself to democracy. I mean, when facts and truth are debatable, democracy itself becomes really impossible to maintain, and we've seen that happen in culture after culture around the globe. I don't think we should go further down that path.
But before the era of electronic news, and when print still ruled, and when even broadcast stations were on a timetable, it wasn't 24/7. You had hours and hours to vet the news. You weren't going up, boom, right away, and then 10 minutes later, this changes the facts, because what's the facts at 4:00 might not be the facts at 6. And it was a lot easier to get it right and to be responsible purveyors of the news. And I don't think it's that easy anymore today. The temptation to whoosh, get it right out there so you get X number of hits is too great, and your survival depends on it. And so it's really difficult to be an honest news consumer today, or a confident news consumer I guess is a better word.
Well, that's a really good point too, because even in the 60s and 70s with the new journalists, people could take 6 months on a story, and they had that luxury, and it was like really in depth. And today you have to be on social, multimedia, plus reporting, plus there are fewer people to do it. So I think that's important for everybody to realize. Well, we have about 10 minutes left, and I just want to encourage anybody who has a question that hasn't been answered to add it in the chat or to raise your hand. I wonder, Stephen and Nolan, if you have any last thoughts that you'd like to offer as we're nearing the end. And, Connie also just said, listen more, understand before seeking to be understood, which is an interesting approach as well. So any other, final thoughts that we want to introduce before we wrap?
I would say that understand that this is worth it. It's worth doing this. I have a good friend here now because we're willing to do this. And, you look at opinion polls all the time that say, 60, 70% of the people don't know anybody or don't consider themselves friends with anyone who doesn't share their viewpoints, who has what a boring world that would be to live in. And, where's your challenge there? Where's your stimulation? Where's the prod to think deeper, to go deeper, to not be so comfortable in your opinions? Good debate, good, honest, civil debate. It's healthy for our society. Getting ideas out there where they're aired and can be debated and discredited when necessary. That's a healthy process. And I think we're too afraid. We're becoming too afraid. And we've also assigned too high a cost to those sort of exchanges. Everybody's scared to death they're going to say the wrong thing and lose their place in society. We see people who share the same ideologies turning on each other. You got people who thought they were liberals in good standing now can't show their face in public. You got Republicans being censured for not being conservative enough. This is getting crazy. We've got to tolerate different and encourage different viewpoints and the debate of those viewpoints. This area, this place we're going to now, where it's not okay to dissent, is very dangerous. And we've seen how it turns out throughout history.
Yeah. I would say that the best place to do this, the best place to start this is in your immediate life, right? The people that you see all the time, the people you see at work or in your neighborhood or at church. Those are the places where we have the ability to create these kinds of relationships that cast things in a different direction. And too often, I think it's easy to sit back and watch the uncivil world around us just tear itself apart and think, well, I can't do anything about that. And you're right that a lot of it is beyond your own reach. But what is within your reach is the people who are around you and the relationships that you are able to build, and focusing some of that energy on forming those relationships with people who disagree is a really proactive way to fight back against the incivility that might be driving you crazy on social media or on television.
And I'd really like to leave with this thought. Don't default to hate. You hear too many people saying, I hate this person because of their political viewpoints. Steve and I hear it every day. Just got emails this morning from one particularly awful email from someone who called me names. I wouldn't call somebody who threw a rock through my window simply because I expressed an opinion he disagrees with. And Steve, you get that every day too. I imagine people hate us or think they hate us and they don't know us. And that's sort of an awful feeling when you're in the public eye. You get used to it, you develop a thick skin, but this idea that people who don't even know you passionately hate you. And I always tell a story about one of my, first encounters with Steve. We were on Mackinac Island for the Republican State Convention and having a drink at the bar. And I walked away and these two ladies came up to me. I'd known him a while. And they said, how could you talk to him? How could you be friends with him? How could you be drinking with him? He's so awful. We just hate him. I said, well, do you know him? Have you ever met him? No. I said, you can't possibly know that you hate him if you haven't spoken to him. And I asked them just to go over and introduce themselves. And they did. And they talked for hours, it seemed like. And when they walked away, they came up to me, oh, he's wonderful. He's just great. No, nothing about Steve's opinions had changed. They had taken the time to know him as something other than his politics. And I think that's a useful lesson to leave you with. There is just far too much hating going on, and we got to stop.
Thank you so much. This has been really great. I appreciate everybody who asked questions and all of you for sticking with us for an hour. I hope this was really interesting and fruitful for you. And I'd love to hear what happens at your 12:30 debrief. So Marilyn, if you don't mind sending me an update, I'd love to hear it. And we'll add this to our website. And thank you so much for being part of this. We really appreciate it.
Thanks to all of you.
Yeah.
Thank you.